because there's lots to cover. And I'm delighted we've had a couple come from San Antonio, get babysitters, drive all the way up. And there's somebody here in every combination whom I've known before. Don, I've known for years through PFLAG, because he's been right there for spouses since '86, I suppose, when we started the task force. And Bob I've known, and Jackie, and Sarah. Bill I just met, but at least we talked by voicemail. And Val I've known too, so this is very exciting. I want to start with why I'm doing it and why I started 13 years ago last month doing this research, and why I did it. And then I'll go into common issues of straight spouses and common issues of children, and then we'll break for questions and answers, and then I'll try to summarize as best I can at the end. This video is being put together thanks to Val and Lloyd, because they wanted to record something that we could then take with us and send out to educate people about the straight spouses issues, which are usually ignored because they're hard to understand. So why did I start the book? My husband of 25 years came out in 1983, and he had known he was gay. He had been active. He had had a lover before we got married, but I didn't know that. And he thought that he was doing the right thing to get married, so for 24 years he repressed it. And in the last few years, he sort of disintegrated in front of me, and the marriage disintegrated, and the marriage died, actually, and he almost did, and so we separated, and then he came out and told me. Then he was happy and healthy in the man that I first married. Then he said he could no longer marry because the same thing would happen again. One of his best friends was president of the Gay Fathers of San Francisco, and he said that there were so many fathers there that couldn't understand once married gay men and bisexual men who couldn't understand why their wives were so angry, and they've looked everywhere for a book, and why didn't I write it? So, being ever optimistic, I said, sure. So 5 years later, my first book came out, and in the process, I realized there were lesbians coming out too, and there were bisexuals, and there were, now I'm into the transgendered, but at that time, I kept expanding the book. The second edition came out when I realized that coming out is a family affair, and there are children involved. So the second expanded edition had children's stories. And now I'm working on something else. But at the moment, I want to share with you what I know so far. So for 13 years, I've been talking with gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered spouses and children, maybe 2,500 by now. I'm hearing their stories and listening to both sides. So I'll share as much as I can under the circumstances. Probably every story is different. There have been 2,500 different stories, but there are some issues that are common. And one of the things that's the most common is the isolation and being ignored and neglected by everyone else in society. Because coming out as gay or lesbian is it's newsworthy. But, what's the straight spouse? After all, he doesn't come out as being straight, always was straight. So why are those issues ignored, and why is it important for us not to ignore them? I hope those questions are answered by the end of this time. There are probably 6 major issues. There are areas of issues that the spouse faces. And when I go into them, all of you who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual in the room will recognize them. Because what I've discovered is that every member of the family goes through the same issues from a different perspective. And they are sexuality, traditional marriage, the child-parent bonds, identity, the whole business of morality from a religious point of view, or deception from your own integrity point of view, and a crisis of faith. And since most of you by now know what the gay and lesbian crisis is, because there are many, many books out there, I won't go into that. But I will start with the straight spouse. Oops. Okay. The sexuality issue for the straight spouse, well, in the beginning, when the husband or wife comes out, there is utter shock and devastation, and you don't even know there are issues. And you have to work through to get them. But the first one to really raise its head is the sexuality issue, which could be feeling rejected as a man or a woman, or that you may have been dysfunctional all your marriage life because of this sexual mismatch in orientation and function. It could be you feel, if you're a wife, you're often afraid of AIDS or sexually transmitted diseases. But the sexual rejection as a man or of a woman, at some point, most straight spouses really start dealing with. In the book, Dan is the one I remember the most. He's a commercial pilot, and he was into human growth potential, and was going to lots and lots of workshops. And he thought his wife, he was a commercial pilot, and therefore had to move a lot. Therefore, his wife had to move with him, and every time she moved, she was depressed. And he figured this was the natural thing for being depressed. Well, their last move, she was very depressed, and he thought, well, maybe she should go to these workshops with me. So he got her to come, and when he walked in the door, he introduced her to a woman who had impressed him at the last meeting. And she was impressive because she stood up in front of the group and said, "My name is Nanette, and I am bisexual." And he thought, well, that's pretty wonderful that someone could be so comfortable with his or her orientation to stand up. I think my wife, it'd be good for her to meet. 10 days later, his wife and Nanette ran off together, lived together, their children were there together, they raised them together, and he fell apart as a man. And here, an airplane pilot usually thinks of himself as pretty macho. He thought he wasn't. He put on about 100 pounds. He discovered his mechanic was a woman. His instructor who took him out for the yearly test turned out to be a woman, and he flunked it. He let the house go to pot. He asked his men's group if they could get him a date. They said, "No, you're a mess." He went out in the car and cried and decided, all right, I'm going to become a triathlete. It's the only way I can get myself back to think of myself as a man. And to this day, he's a triathlete. And I tell the story only because it shows how much the sexual identity is tied up with your whole identity in your gender as well as your sexuality. It took him 6 years to get courage enough to get married again, and he did get married to a flight attendant. Now Jane, on the other hand, who's also in the book, her sexuality, she and her husband, they did not have children. They decided they would have an open marriage, and so different lovers came and went. And after a while, they realized that that this was not really very helpful. It was not helping their marriage. They didn't tell anyone, and so they had told the secret to no one, and they thought the best thing to keep their friendship was to separate. In the meantime, she got pregnant with her husband, and she thought to herself, oh, this proves I still am a woman. And she lost the baby in a miscarriage, and said, this proves I'm not. So once again, the whole sexuality thing and the rejection as a man or a woman. She got through the process by going away for 3 years, doing a lot of meditating by the ocean in California, taking women's liberation courses, psychology, and she found meaning in life of becoming a minister. This is Jane Vennard. And so she's now a minister in Denver, remarried, and teaching spirituality and how to get rid of homophobia in the seminary. So, but all of this because of her husband's coming out. The sexual rejection, the sexual dysfunction, a lot of women, women particularly, the straight wives, feel that maybe they were shortchanged in their marriage, that maybe they'll never be able to find anyone else again. Some men also feel that way. Men usually tend to be left more quickly by their lesbian wives if the lesbian wives come out. But there are some lesbian and bisexual wives who do stay married. But those who leave, come out and leave at the same time, it's a double whammy. So the men drop very, very low, very, very fast, and have to come back very, very quickly. So they tend to get through the sexuality thing a little faster, but it's still difficult. Some some women particularly are so confused with their sexuality after their best friend, their intimate friend comes out, that they or feel so starved that they sometimes think they may be lesbian or bisexual. and get very, very close to other women, and then realize, no, they're still heterosexual. It was just a starvation kind of thing. But it really affects the whole of the straight spouse. I'm taking a long time with this because it's one of the two biggest issues. The other one that I'll get to is the deception closet issue. The marriage challenge is also complicated because if the person comes out, you know, there are many kinds of options. Most couples don't think there are any options, but there are many kinds of options. But whatever option it is, the marriage is no longer the same traditional marriage. You have to redefine it. Some men come out and they still decide that they will be monogamous. Some women come out, they decide they will be monogamous. Some feel, no, they have to have somebody on the side, but the straight spouse can be the primary person. Some, they have open marriages, not too many, but some do. But there are all kinds of things. But the challenge to your head on having a traditional marriage and fitting it into your pictures of what marriage is like is very disconcerting and very scary to be different from the rest of society. And it's that being different from the rest of society that helps put you even more in the closet. One of the things that happens to straight spouses, which many gay and lesbians don't realize at first, is that they too go in the closet. They too feel stigmatized. They don't want to tell anybody for fear that their husband or wife will lose his job or that their kids will be teased in school. So they're in the closet, and here they're in this marriage that's now no longer the same, so they don't want to tell anybody because people will say you're crazy to stay or you're immoral to stay. It's very, very confusing. So we have the sexuality issue, the challenge to the traditional marriage issue, and then one that's typical of other divorces, but in this case is even more complicated, the conflict between being hurt as a spouse and being protective of the child's bond with the other parent so the child isn't upset. Because the majority, not all, but the majority of these marriages end in divorce. So that the straight spouse who's hurt doesn't want the child to feel even more upset by the family breakup than possible. Not only that, the parents are afraid of the effects on the child of what the community thinks about any anti-gay attitudes in the community. So many of the spouses take a lot of time trying to educate the children in the fact that if they're teased, it's the other person's ignorance that does it, helps them to arm them with ways to get back at someone else and say, well, if they hear anti-gay jokes, to say, well, you know, you're talking about my parents, don't do that. But that takes doing. You can't do that the first year after a husband or wife comes out. But all these thoughts go through the straight parent's head. And the straight parent is the model, from the children's point of view, the straight parent is the model of how they will take the news. Because if the straight parent is angry, the child won't necessarily be angry, but they'll get the picture that it's conflicting and that they'll be caught up in the division of loyalties. So these three things are issues that come to the fore the first year as you're working through the issues. The next three are more profound, more complex, and take a long time to get through. They have to do with their straight spouse's own identity, the deception issue, whether or not the spouse hid it, and then the whole crisis of faith. I was talking with Bill this morning, and he uses one of my favorite words about this, which is the coming out of someone that you know, love, trusted, and intimate with as somebody of a different orientation is a matter of dissonance, cognitive dissonance. You've got these two pictures, this picture of your spouse as you thought it was, and the picture of who he or she has come out as. And it takes a long time to put those two together in the person. This one will never be true, but it's still the same person, and that takes a long time. The straight spouse is going through the same thing, because the straight spouse often will say to me, I feel I've been living someone else. his or her lie without knowing it. Well, most gay and lesbian spouses do not, these days, do not necessarily marry for the purpose of hiding. A lot of them don't know, they don't want to know, they're told that if they get married, they're still being told, you get married, it'll straighten you out. They think they love this person so much that it won't ever be a problem. I'm getting calls now from 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. Now, you'd think they'd know now that this is very difficult to be married this way, but the Stonewall did not make that much of a difference. The American Psychiatric Association saying it was no longer a disease didn't make that much of a difference. The young ones are still coming out. So the straight spouse goes through the same identity, and the question usually comes after a while of trying to accommodate, trying to understand, trying to support, to say, well, what about me? What about my needs? What about my feelings? What about my wants? And that triggers this crisis of identity. And in a way, looking back, spouses will say this was a blessing because I learned more about myself and I grew. But at the time, to wonder, well, who am I? What can I do? What does this mean for me? Because the future of who you thought isn't the same. The behaviors that you did before, it won't work. So who am I is one of the big changing points. Let me mention some things here. Many times this occurs after the first year, as I said, and spouses will look at themselves and say, oh my goodness, I've put on 40 pounds. Or my goodness, I've lost 30 pounds. Or I've taken up smoking again. Or I'm drinking too much wine. All this business to try to get through this first year of shock. And I've used that arbitrarily, but it usually takes about a year. And so the question is then, how can I start rebuilding up my own self-concept, my own self-esteem, so that I'm not turning to these chemicals or alcohol or whatever. And people do it in different ways. The first year, because it's so painful, there's a lot of denial, there's a lot of cover-up, there's a lot of hiding, so you have to peel off all these layers. Also, if you've been living with someone who's a different orientation that you didn't know, you sometimes go, what we have found is that you go back into you rewrite your own marriage, knowing what you know now, and you say, oh yeah, that's what happened. This is why my husband didn't like to go out and have dinner with our friends, because he was afraid that he'd hit on them. Oh yes, now I know why she said she couldn't understand me. I couldn't understand her because she was lesbian, and of course I couldn't understand her. Oh yes, so you go back and try to find all those things that made you who you were, and it becomes almost a self-search, as one of the spouses told me recently. So the identity crisis with the straight spouse is something that most of them go through in order to be strong enough to say, all right, well, how do I handle this from here? Do I stay? Do I leave? How can I get my needs across to him or her? And that takes a lot of doing, and at that point therapy may be somewhat helpful. In the earlier stages, when it's a matter of sexual orientation and the sexuality issues, unless the psychologist or therapist really knows and has had clients like this, sometimes they don't offer the best kind of advice. Like they'll say, well, why don't you just communicate better? Maybe the marriage will be saved. Or why don't you do this, which are really irrelevant. So, but when they start this last three businesses, at least for the identity crisis, therapy can be really helpful. One of the women I was on television once said that she felt when her husband came out, it was right. Well, if you had read the article that we had in the New York Times, she was interviewed for the New York Times. And it was right before the weekend of the Oklahoma building bombing. She said she felt as if she were that building had been bombed and her whole insides were out. So it took, that was the way it felt. And so she had to put it all back together again. Another woman who is now 70, this happened, her husband was a missionary. They'd grown up in India. He was, I forget which, he was a very, wasn't evangelical, but very conservative religion. And he had a heart attack in Texas and discovered a charismatic religious group here and realized that all this time, all this heart business was his orientation. He came out. She said she curled up in bed naked and just held herself. That's the only way she could contain her pain. But by the time I met her, it was about a year later, and by then she was trying to remember what made her what she was, and she was taking up square dancing, and it isn't that easy. I'm making it sound easy, but I'm saying this, that it takes so much time to go through the earlier pain. And the goal of this period is to change one's self-concept from I am the spouse of a gay or lesbian or bisexual person to I am I, and build up the identity. And then the crisis can be dealt with. As I'm talking, any of you who are gay and lesbian and bisexual here, you remember those struggles you went through to find out who you were. But by the time you come out, the spouse isn't where you are, and you have to sit and wait for them to go through all of this. The deception issue is probably the most complex, and I'm not saying that all gays and lesbians deceive, but when your husband or wife comes out as someone different, you feel deceived. I call it perceived deception. You feel that, as I said earlier, that you're living someone else's lie without knowing it. You feel duped. Many times, because of anti-gay attitudes in the community, you also have to lie. If the in-laws don't know and he's out at gay bars in the evening and they say, "Where's Joe?" you say he's out bowling. I mean, and this whole morality, lying, moral compass, truth, false issues are very much mixed up in the straight spouse's mind, and I call it the moral compass being shattered. So once again, you have to, as a straight spouse, go through and sort out all your values again. What really is truth? What really is false? What is the most important thing? And what are my moral values? And what I can compromise just so far, but what don't I want to compromise? What's my bottom line? This takes at least 3 years. You really can't do it overnight. It just takes forever. One of the story, and you can't even make up your mind until something makes it clear. There's a story in here, Caitlin, whose husband, he was Hispanic. He was the first person in his family to go to high school, to go to college, to go to graduate school, to get his PhD. Brilliant man, and it was determined to make a go of the marriage. When he first came out, they stayed together. They agreed that he wouldn't see his lover anymore. He broke that agreement. They separated for a while. They came back. He promised he wouldn't see him again. He did. And so Caitlin was, I recall, lying in bed trying to figure out how to handle this, because they had 4 children. When he came out, they had 4 children, 8 and under. One was adopted. There were 2 twins. She had worked so that he could go to graduate school. So one night she's lying in bed trying to figure out what to do. And she says, "Why am I giving my whole life to this marriage? What do I get out of it? Give me crumbs and I'll stick around? I can't even have sex with anyone else. I can't be an unfaithful wife. And then her thoughts switched. Wait, Miguel is the one who's unfaithful. You don't even have a marriage you can morally agree with, Caitlin. It's not based on faith and trust. Your view of right and wrong is screwed up. What Miguel is doing wrong. Therefore, this marriage can't last. Of course, my fantasy couldn't come true. Now, I'm not saying all marriages can't come true, but it's you want it so badly that sometimes compromises are made you don't want to in the end. My own personal experience is I, to this day, cannot understand why my husband did not tell me. I mean, I can understand intellectually, but deception, that not knowing all that time when I was struggling to have a good marriage, just puzzles me. And I finally decided I'll never be able to figure out it. It's a mystery of life, and that's it. So it may never be figured out. It's one of those things you can't, it's part of the package, and I let it go. If your person that you are close to and you know comes out as a different person, if your marriage no longer is the same, if your identity is in crisis, if your moral values are all collapsed, of course you have a crisis of faith. What do you believe in? One of the ways that I've seen of described spouses, and they've described myself to me, is that without identity you feel pretty hopeless, and without a sense of truth you feel powerless because the closet is running your life, and without this you feel bereft of any kind of meaning. So one of the reasons we say it takes a long time to get through this is to build up your faith system again. One has to put together who you are, get all the moral values together, get your philosophy of life in place, and then take this leap of faith that you can believe in something. So what many spouses do is they turn to music, turn to art, something beyond themselves which have meaning. Hiking, music, a lot of spiritual reading, other friends, physical exercise, as this man did, being a triathlete, but something that gives your life meaning. It takes 3 to 6 years to really sort of be back, fully, not back, rebuild, to heal and rebuild. And my feeling is that if it takes that long, you can see how much the devastation was in the beginning. Most spouses go through these stages, as many people have compared it to stages of death. In this case, however, the spouse is not dead. And that's what makes it very difficult. The spouse is still there, you still love them or hate them, but they're still there. And so one of the things that in the stages of going through this, first there's a lot of wanting to deny the reality, and then there's a point, and this is a point that I think a lot of people forget, is they say, oh yeah, and then you have to accept. Well, before you accept, you have to face it. You have to face the fact that your husband or wife has come out, and you have to face the fact that you hurt. And it's okay to hurt, and it's okay to feel angry. It's quite natural. So you face them both, and then try to understand, and then comes the acceptance. Now, you can either accept or continue to deny. That's a choice. The next choice is you can either grieve the loss of what was, or you can sit and wallow in your own pity that it's pretty bad, isn't it? You can stay stuck in your anger, which I think is as strong a bond as love, because it still ties you to the person emotionally. You can stay angry, or you can work through the anger in some kind of constructive, positive way and put it to getting yourself to grow and let that go by. As I said, you can grieve and then move on, or you can stay in despair. And unfortunately, fortunately it's a small number, but unfortunately there are some spouses who are still stuck and angry and bitter And they're the ones that people hear from and they think all spouses are that way. It's only a small number. All right, so those are the stages, and as you think of them, they're all painful, they're all negative. If you put on top of that the fact that no one pays attention to spouses and they're isolated, all those feelings are magnified. This is why I'm thankful to people like Jackie and Sarah and Bob who have made themselves available to other spouses in the area so they're not alone. Because if you're not alone, these issues aren't quite as, number one, they aren't quite as horrendous because you see them through other people's eyes and you're sharing the pain. And number two, they'll help you by validating. Okay, these are the spouse's issues. Now, do you want to ask questions now or have me go on to the children's issues and then ask questions? Which would you? I mean, this is a lot to throw out at you at once.
I guess we should start with questions on this subject or this section.
All right, fine.
You talk about 3 years, that it takes about 3 years for this to kind of make its way through. When does that begin?
For the moment the person comes out.
So regardless of whether there is an immediate divorce or 5 years in between that time?
Oh, it's kind of a guesstimate on my part, but it certainly isn't over in a year. I had one spouse who she ran a support group, and she said, I was through it in a year. 3 years later, she was in the hospital with an emotional kind of a thing that she hadn't quite worked it through. I'm not saying you're not back on your feet, but not fully through. And so, you may be the grand different person, I don't know. But that's just what seems to happen because you're such shock when it first happens, unless you've had inklings, but most spouses haven't. You're in such shock. And my feeling about shock is it gives your body a chance to recoup so that you can fight when you're on your feet again. The shock takes quite a while.
I would add to that, just a supplement. I was speaking with a woman the other day who had divorced her husband, and I was speaking to her about my situation, and she immediately began crying and remembering her situation. And I said, how long ago was it? She said 12 years. I went, 12 years? Am I going to be like this?
No. She may not have had anyone to talk to before. I've had women come to my group after 15 years and they sit there and they weep and weep. I never talked to anyone. So it's all that pent up stuff. No, it won't take you 12 years.
Good.
Is there a difference that you see between marriages where a spouse is gay, male or female, and one where they're bisexual?
Oh, definitely.
Could you talk about that?
Well, the major difference is that the woman feels, or the man in that case, the heterosexual spouse feels less rejected sexually because they can still have a sexual relationship and intimacy. That's the major differences.
Okay, I'm going to have to work on that. My spouse refuses to come out as anything, doesn't want to have a label, will sort of entertain the idea of being bisexual, but my observation is that he doesn't even look at women. So, I think he's feeling...
You have to just deal with the present and just go day by day. And labels really, as the head of the International Lesbian and Gay Organization said once when I was in London giving a talk, she said, I don't care what you call yourself, just tell me what you do.
Yeah, that's all I want from him, is
Right.
the truth,
Right.
Where are you?
Right, yeah. Okay. The children's issues are mainly come up if the parents divorce. That is the greater trauma to them until they become teenagers. So remember I said earlier that the gay spouse, the straight spouse, and the children all go through the same area of issues: sexuality, the marriage, parent-child, identity, integrity, moral issues, and belief. Well, the things that are upsetting to the children now, in elementary school classrooms, there's a lot of anti-gay jokes. I mean, they're just, the words fag, like those kinds of things, are used in a derogatory manner. Not necessarily that the little ones know what it is, but if the child knows that that's what it means, they take it on themselves as a slur. But in general, they don't even know until they're either sexual themselves, which is getting younger and younger these days, what homosexuality is. So that is not an issue as much as their father now or mother dressing differently, different mannerisms that are stereotypical that could make them embarrassed. There's a story in the book where the father, the daughter has somebody over for the night, and in their divorce situation, the children didn't go back from house to house. The parents changed, and the kids stay in the same house. So it was Dad's turn to be in the house, and his friend was there, and he was slightly drugged, so he was doing a lot of stereotypical movements, and it embarrassed the girls, the children. So it's the atypical sexuality, their parents being different, looking different, acting different, any kind of stereotypical mannerisms. But the sexuality thing up until teenagers is pretty much just that they look different from other people's dads or other people's moms, or the way they think that men are or women are. But it really doesn't matter that much. This is regardless of whether it's a divorce. If, however, the family decides that it's the best for everybody to divorce or separate, the children go through the usual divorce problems, which are intensified by the gay factor. So that if they're divorcing because one came out, then the gay factor can sometimes be used as in the division of loyalties. They'll think, well, one's gay and the other's straight. Or if there's anger between the two spouses, the kids can see it in terms of gay versus straight. And all those gay versus straight polarities color the divorce problem. So it can be difficult. But they're mainly concerned that both parents love them, that both parents are there for them, that they have a secure house, it's a safe place, they're well taken care of. And so that could happen in both houses. One of my favorite stories I tell all the time is this boy who was in second grade when his mother and father divorced. His mother came out. He lived with her and her lover in, I forget what state. She went to, he said he got to be sixth grade, he figured it out, that they were lesbian. Before that, they were just, he had no other families to compare it to, but he figured it out. When he was 16, he said, I want to go live with my father. So his father lived in Texas, actually, and he came to Texas, and after a month later, he wrote back and said, I can't stand it. My stepmother's homophobic, I can't stand it. And his mother said, you made the choice, you stay there for the rest of the year. And he did. Now I tell that story because it's a mother acting responsibly, not giving in. The boy being able to see it now and realizing this was but it was his father, and he was able to handle it. But the home in Florida was the one where he felt safe and secure. And a similar story is a young woman who's now 23, but when she was 12, her dad came out. Her mother got very promiscuous to prove to herself that she was a woman. See, her sexuality was concerned, so she became promiscuous. So this 12-year-old took care of the 10-year-old sister. Finally, when she was 16, she left to live with her father and his lover, and it was wonderful. There was a curfew. She had chores to do in the house. She could keep her room messy, but just close the door. That's where she found structure. So the whole family disruption thing needn't be horrendous if they both get good parenting in both homes, which has nothing to do with being gay or lesbian. And the children know the difference. So they're very wise. We adults make things worse than they are. The children, they want to be loved, they want to be cared for, they want to be safe. But when they become teenagers, Even if their children, the dads came out when they were little, they need to reprocess it. Because guess what? They're going through their own sexuality and identity issues. And so if they have to go through it all because they know now what their parents went through. And so they go through it. And so the parents need to be there with all the information they need to answer their questions and support them through that. The threat to the parent-child bond, the only thing that usually happens in that line when the dad or mom comes out is, are you going to leave? Or am I going to be gay? But are you going to leave me? Are you going to abandon me? Because they sometimes get very angry. Maybe you're abandoning if you're a father coming out, you're abandoning the mother. And so it just takes a lot of loving, caring, just being a good parent. But this is what the children have told me that I interviewed. When they're teenagers too, no teenager wants to be different. Well, this makes them a little bit more different. And so they don't want to tell. They don't want to talk about it. They feel very isolated, just like the straight spouse. And this is a problem, not only because they're isolated and have to hide, but they never have a chance. You know, little girls, when they're teenagers, all the gossip and stuff, and the boys are very much peer-oriented. If they can't share this very important thing, they don't have the practice in intimacy that can happen. They can't share the secrets. And I'll tell you later about support systems for children so they can find there are others like them and they can talk about it. I interviewed a little girl, 17, and I had interviewed her mother 8 years before. And I knew she and her dad had a wonderful relationship. He would come over, dress her, and take her to school every morning. And it was just wonderful. So I said, you know, how is it, Kathleen? And she said, well, I still haven't talked to anyone, and I am so afraid that when I do, I'm going to explode. Now, she didn't say about what, but she'd been working through all these things by herself, didn't want to burden her mom with it, and she was just ready. So they did find a therapy group for her. The secrecy, having to keep the secret. There's a story in the book about two girls whose mother had a lover, and so anytime they had friends home from school, they'd run around the house and they'd hide all the photographs and they'd hide all the whatever, any evidence. It took them to be 20 before they told somebody. And happened to be a group of children at one of the first collage conferences. And they, you know, here are all these others who had dads and moms like this, and now they're the greatest kind of spokespersons for it. But the secrecy and the moral confusion. There are two sad stories in the book. One of them turns out to be all right. It's called Two Minor Miracles. The family was in a Presbyterian church, so he was a deacon. I have to say Presbyterian church because I'm not sure where, but not a Catholic deacon, a Presbyterian deacon. The mother came out, the pastor of the church announced it from the pulpit. He was ousted from the deaconship. The youth minister told the son that his mother was going to go to hell. And the confusion in that child, he would never play with anyone after school. He'd come right home. He'd hide in his room. Gradually, the father listened. The father, of course, was having a hard time, too. I won't go into his story. But they listened. The father worked through it. Took him about a year, I'd say. A lot of anger, walked the streets at night, shouting epithets at all the drunks he'd passed, just because to get it out, pretending to sing in the shower when he was really sobbing, and finally getting to pray. And so they did work out. And the two minor miracles were that his wife was still the wonderful woman that he married and was a good mother. But he had to work through all of that. But the kid was really upset. And it took a lot of talking to get him to realize. that, of course his mother wasn't going to hell. The uncertain life goals, traditional concepts. I interviewed a psychologist in the Midwest who was working with the children whose mother I'd interviewed. And she was saying how difficult it was because the coming out of a parent shattered three concepts. The traditional concepts, what a marriage is like, what genders are like, and what their future held. And so they have to, as another study came out, what children learn is there are many more options than any of us ever knew. There are more options out there. We aren't put into little closed paradigms, they can shift. But these are what the children are going through, so both parents have to be there for them. And notice that very little of them have to do with homosexuality in and of itself. It's how it relates to the whole of society as they see it. I know I'm going very fast, but nothing I can do, but I want to share with you a poem written by the girl I told you about whose father was cavorting out with his friend, and she was embarrassed. I interviewed her when she was 15, and at that time she told me what she hadn't told her mother, that she had slashed her wrists. Not because her father was gay, but because she couldn't handle the anger. She didn't know how to control her life. The only thing she could control was her life with cutting. And she'd just wear long sleeves to school, and she was self-mutilating, not really committing suicide. Her younger brother was in junior high. He didn't want to talk about it, so the grandmother would invite him over to cut the grass and things because the grandmother knows it's a safe place, so he would go over and cut the grass and talk to her. The 8-year-old wanted to be a paleontologist, and that's all he cared about. It was cool that his dad was gay. So all in one family, you get different reactions. She went to high school, and this girl, she was just starting then, and she didn't want to tell anybody because she was afraid of her younger brothers, it was a private school, and they all were there. Word would get around. But one day in social studies class, somebody was saying some bad gay joke, and she stood up and she said, "Do you think anyone in his right mind would want to be gay with what happens to them?" And she was able to do that. Let me read you the poem that she sent me shortly thereafter. It's called Debacle. I am all alone, fighting a grown-up fight, living a grown-up life in a world where race, religion, and identity decide your destiny. This ignorance, this stupidity, I am ashamed sometimes of the world we live in, fighting, dying, lying, crying. It never ends. I never had the chance to be a kid, to be innocent, to be free. These battles are all I've known. Bitterness, prejudice, indifference, dividing us all until each person stands alone. Why can't they see we're all the same? Same sun, same sky, same stars we all sleep under. It takes too much energy to hate. Besides, I am you, and you are me. People are people. People have hearts. Hearts are meant to love. Still, I am all alone. Yeah. Thank heaven she had an English teacher that encouraged this, so she could write it out. So that's the children's side of things, the children's side of the closet.
Who tells the children?
Preferably both parents, so the child can see that the straight parent is standing behind the gay one. But most of the children whom I've interviewed have said to a person, the sooner you tell them, the better. Well, I can also say, number one, parents should be comfortable enough to tell them so they can support the kids if they fall apart. Because the initial feeling may be shock and surprise or indifference, but it has to be there for them. And if there's no other way that they'll know, there's no need to tell them. If you aren't splitting up, but if there's family tension, they usually know something's amiss. But both of them is probably better. I have a piece here about telling I can share. It's a good question.
Do they sometimes know before anybody tells them?
Mm-hmm.
Not just that something's amiss, but they have a pretty good idea.
It depends how old they are. One girl, one spouse in my support group, her daughter found an email on her father's email. He'd forgotten to erase it. So she knew, and she told the brother, and they asked the father. So the wife was the last to know. She's doing all right.
Amity, only an observation, but it seems to me that if the children are deprived of this knowledge, they're going to have the same sense of deception that the straight
That's what they say. They say, that's why they told me, come out as soon as you can, because otherwise we think you didn't trust us. And then the other thing is to stay honest. There were two girls in Southern California. Their father came out when they were, I don't know, 6 or 8 or something. And they said, okay, promise us that you will tell us if you get AIDS. HIV positive. Well, he did become HIV positive, and he didn't tell them. And when I interviewed the older daughter, who was by then 20, she said, I don't trust anybody. I've lost my trust. Well, she did find it. She turned out to be bisexual. She now has a partner. They have a child. She did learn to trust. But thank you for bringing that. Definitely.
We forget that children are like people.
And we don't give them credit. They're much more resilient than we are. Much more resilient.
In a small group at P Flag one Sunday, there was a father who had just come out to his family, and the children were pretty well grown. They were 18, 20-ish, I don't remember exactly. And he said there'd been a great deal of upset in the family. You know, first he'd come out to his wife, and there was a lot of stuff going on. And then he had told the daughter, and the son was the last one he told. Just it had worked. The son was away or something, and there'd only been a lag time, I think, of a week or so. But there had just been all this turmoil in the house, and the time had come, and they'd agreed that they would talk at a certain time. And he said, I was crying, and I was telling him, and when he finally told him, the son said, is that all? I thought you were dying or something.
Yeah.
You're saying if they are told younger and grow into the teen years, you can expect to regroove some of that? With
Yeah,
them?
just reprocess it. It isn't the shock, but just reprocess in terms of who they are. Because they're going through their identity thing, and their own sexuality is blossoming, and could I be gay or could I be bisexual? And
How common is it for the children to worry about their orientation because they have a gay
very,
parent?
very common. And
Will they talk about that as easily, or is that something they bring up?
well, they will if the straight spouse is supportive and open. Yeah, yes. But maybe, I mean, not always. I mean, my daughter came out. My husband came out in '83. My daughter came out 2 days before. These things are always 3 days before the earthquake, the big Loma Prieta earthquake, and.
You had 2 earthquakes.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a very interesting experience because I said, well, I think it's great because you can be who you are when you're young. Your father could not be who he was until he was in his mid-50s or whatever. But you can be who you are. She was upset that I wasn't more upset. However, I then started thinking about it. And so I got a little tearful just because, you know, your expectations are a little different. Then when I got the news, because I live right across the bay from San Francisco, and oftentimes I'm on the part of the bridge that went down, she was coming over to have dinner with me that night, and she was supposed to be on BART, the subway, under the bay at that time. I went berserk. I said, God, I don't care. I want my child alive. I don't care what she is, you know. So it puts it all into perspective. But
Well,
she never told, my point is she did not share that with me for a long, long, long time.
How common is it for the children the worry about no one will want to marry me because I have a gay parent.
That's common at first, but there isn't. I just finished a chapter for a book on custody and and had to do a review of all the literature, the quantitative literature and the qualitative, and the percentages are perhaps a little more, perhaps not, but whether they turn out gay or lesbian. Well, we don't know whether that means it's genetic or because they're in an environment that says it's okay. You know, if you're living, if you're growing up in a community where it's all heterosexual, you think, and in a church where you're not supposed to be gay or lesbian, then there's no option in your head at all.
Doesn't change it though. If that's who
No,
you are, it
but
doesn't
you
change
can,
it.
whether you can express it or not.
Right.
And there was a study in England, and they followed these daughters of straight mothers and lesbian mothers. And although the children of the lesbian mothers tried out same-sex when they were teenagers, only 2 of them decided that was going to be their life. I mean, just not decided, but because you can't decide your orientation, but you could decide how you're going to live it. And they decided they weren't lesbian in the first place, and they just didn't want to have that kind of a life. So, yeah, the children worry, but if we can support straight spouses through this, and the family still stays together, they see that it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And if some girlfriend didn't want to marry me because I was gay, then I wouldn't want her for a girlfriend or a wife. So they get to be quite mature about this. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I've seen that, and I just wondered how common it was. It seems to be a worry of parents that no one will want to marry.
It's parents, as I said earlier, the worriers. The kids they don't worry that much about it, particularly the younger ones.
Well, our second grader has certainly been involved in the gay jokes and the stuff, and I would classify him as almost homophobic at this point. He thinks gay is a bad thing, and he doesn't know yet. Well, our kids don't know.
Well, do you talk about name calling and that sort of thing?
We've talked about name calling, and we have a close family friend who's a lesbian, and we told them that she was a lesbian. You could see his world sort of shifting. But
That's right.
Our second grader is also very fearful of any kind of change. I mean, he freaked when my wife got a haircut. I mean, it just,
Well, just be careful. Just go slowly. And each child is different. You know, some kids think it's just great to march down in the gay pride parade. Others are too sensitive to say boo. So,
I think that children will mimic the life that they see, and in schools, what they hear and what they see is gay is bad. But when they discover that their parent is, they say, well, my mom or my dad is a good person,
that's right.
and that means that gay can't be bad.
That's
Can't
right.
be a bad person. So they readjust based on their parents and their parents' attitudes.
That's right. And that's why it's so important that the 2 parents can just stay in a positive relationship whether or not they're still married.
Let me ask you this. Of course, when your spouse tells you she's gay and you go through a lot of emotional swings and everything, and you're having to deal with her on a day-to-day basis, you can be angry, you can be sympathetic, and something that dawned on me when I was doing that was that I may very well be going through a dress rehearsal of how my daughter might perceive me receiving her news that she's gay. You know, she may be
Okay.
later on in life going, I remember Dad was just really homophobic,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think I want to share that information with you. Do you see that sort of the things that you're doing at that moment when you're going through that crisis is really bearing out later in life with kids that are...
No, and I'm glad you brought it up, Bob, because the spouse coming out is very different from a parent coming out or a kid coming out. When my daughter came out, I knew she was still my daughter. I was still her mother. When her father came out, she knew that it was still her father. That relationship, you can be estranged, but you can always come back. But with a spouse, it's a chosen relationship. So there's some carryover, but it's so different. So different. And there's a lot of similarity.
My
but
daughter's a teenager, and one of the things I told my spouse at the time was, you know, I'm so afraid that you're going to hurt her like you've hurt me. And after I left, my daughter went through a lot of pain, a lot of adjusting and suffering.
yeah, yeah. And you can't control it.
Yeah.
Just be there for her. Just be there for her and don't feed into it. So it's so hard not to. So I wonder, spouses have any tongues left, because you have to find yourself biting your tongue all the time. You want to say things, and the whole divorce issue is so hard because the gay thing feeds into every single one of the issues: fear of abandonment, separation, division of loyalties.
Loss of hope. Loss of hope apparently is the hardest part of any kind of breakup.
Mm-hmm.
And when you, and marriage, that's what marriage is hope.
Mm. So that's why you have to get into your own identity, so that
Right.
you've got hope for yourself, because that's the only person you can control.
Yeah, my daughters were very young when my ex came out, and since then they've adjusted beautifully. In fact, they're a lot better adjusted than a lot of kids of married couples that are still together. But adolescence is also rushing upon both of them. And I was wondering, are there any statistics of how many kids reject their gay parent when they get to that age?
No. But remember, teenagers reject their parents anyway. And that's why you have to be really, in all of this, you have to separate out the gay issue from ordinary developmental stages, which is why this kid in Florida wanted to come and to stay with his stepfather. Yeah, so there may be, and kids know they know what buttons to push, they know how to hurt, and so they may say this, but it isn't really true.
Maybe it's interesting to me that you haven't mentioned siblings much. I guess it's not such a big problem.
Well, the siblings are there. The story about the two girls whose mother, that had to run around the house hiding pictures, the name of that story is We Were There for Each Other. Siblings are there for each other, and they all need to know. In my family, my husband told the daughter, but not the son. He never spoke to his son about it for 8 years, even though we'd done things with his lover and all sorts of things. But he couldn't bring himself. He was afraid of losing the son's respect. So siblings help one another, but they all react differently.
I'm talking about
Oh, I'm sorry.
big brother or sister.
Yeah,
So maybe that's not an issue.
you're right. No, well, I can talk about the parents, but the siblings all react differently too.
Everybody reacts different.
And if they have a very rigid, preconceived notion that homosexuality isn't good, they won't approve of it. If you're married, some will, you'll get pressures to do both things: stay married or leave, or break up. You can't have, you're going to be married, it has to be monogamous. So they won't have any kind of an alternative arrangement. That's one of my next studies too. So I don't have much statistics, except a lot of anecdotal stuff, that some sisters and brothers are supportive and some are not. Some sisters and brothers are supportive of the straight spouse, hanging in there, and others say, get out.
I think it's safe to say, though, that the relationship that the siblings have prior to the knowledge also depends or helps them either accept or reject in the future.
After the knowledge.
But
Yes, no.
and spouses know that, so they only tell some. Many of the spouses in our group have only told one of all their siblings. And that gets to be a problem, because then when they find out, well, why didn't you tell me? And this social the stigma around it affects everybody. Parents, well, the thing that got me through it was reading the book Now That You Know by Betty Fairchild, because I treated my husband like a child. in the respect of now he's supposed to be what he's supposed to be. I can't say anything about that. Don't know if that helps, but
One of my favorite beliefs is the answer to all important questions is it depends. And I really find that the truth.
Yeah.
So to say what you expect, you don't expect anything, because within a family, two children will be different from each other. But they may have a personality type that you can learn how to predict on that child. But trying to talk that you can really learn something from statistics, I think it's a waste of time. You can learn about the whole pot, but you can't learn about the pea.
well, that's why I like the question. Somebody said, "How common is it?" Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that kind of a question because, and of course, a lot of people don't talk. They're also isolated. We have no idea how many people are in this situation everywhere. But I do know that once I talk to somebody about it, they'll say, "Oh yes, Aunt Nellie came out," and "Oh yes, down the street, I'd forgotten that." And if you're talking about parents, you find out, yeah, I have a gay son, and we can somehow get people able to talk about it and say it's all right.
What you just said is very, very important. We have a support group, as you know, the Straight Spouse Support Network, and we have a group of, I don't know, maybe 20 people that have come on and off, some that are core people who stay around. But I was talking with a friend of mine whose husband came out last year, same time as my wife, and she said he goes to the gay dads group, and there must be 70, 80 of these.
That's
people.
right, and where are their wives?
Spouses.
Yeah.
Where are the wives? They don't come to
Yeah.
these meetings, so I know that there are a lot of people out there that probably suffer quietly and don't get the healing that they need.
And I worry about their children too, because unless this, I really feel the straight spouse is pivotal in this, because if they're there as models, particularly if it's the wife who's there with the kids more often than the dads, but there are a lot of gay dads who have the children, that they can't be living with an angry person. And I didn't realize, one of the spouses I interviewed here, it's called Mom's Daughter, Dad's Son. And the gay father had rejected the second child that was born. And so she told me this story, and she said how she supported the kids coming home from school. Somebody had said fag lover on the daughter's locker, and she'd help them through it, and somebody else was teased. But I found out when I interviewed the daughter 8 years later that mother is still angry, and the daughter knew it, and the daughter's a mess because of it. But she hid the anger. She was trying so hard to be the good fixer-upper, she never dealt with her own stuff. So.
The religious issue for families that are seriously involved in some religion, is there any special problems with this that people
It's so hard.
It amplifies a lot of the problem, because the religious position is usually negative, and it just ups the current,
Absolutely.
and the short fusing goes on.
Particularly if they divorce, because the saddest story in the book is the one who's told by the guy who's dying of AIDS. He was a friend of mine, actually. He told his story for 4 hours on tape when he was in a hospice, and his wife had said, well, if you have a choice, either stop being gay or stop being married. So he said, I can't stop being gay. And then he got AIDS, and she said, well, it's the fits punishment for the work of the devil, and forbade the children to visit him as he was dying. And the child-parent bond was not as important to her as this picture she had of what was right and wrong. Children seem to be able to get through it. In the long run, they can, when they get to be adults, but some don't. One man who's now an MCC priest, actually, minister, had wanted to become an Episcopal priest. They wouldn't let him because he was gay. And his wife, he hasn't seen his son for probably 15 years now, because the son did pick it up from the mother. Now, the kids in the book did keep in touch with the family through their grandmother, so they came back. There's just a lot of work to do with society, and my feeling is that the more spouses can be supported, the more they can be advocates for getting rid of anti-gay attitudes. Because what stronger advocate can you have for someone who was hurt and still go out and say, look, let people be who they are. Not only were our husbands and wives hurt, but so were we and so were our kids. There's no magic answer to that, except to speak out. I will. I'm going to speak to PFLAG on Sunday.
I have a question, if I may. One of these, is it common, that kind of questions. Reading in your book, you do have quote some statistics. I thought maybe you could talk about this subject. I know a lot of women whose husbands have come out, and those husbands seem to go overboard in trying to create a strong relationship outside of a marriage. Friendship, all kinds of things they do together. Whereas I've noticed, and I have read, that when the wife is the one, it's a different situation. Very negative, very closed down, no friendship, no discussion. Just end of story. Can you talk about that?
Well, most but not all lesbians who, when they come out to their husbands, also want to leave because they want to live in the lesbian community or they have a lover. And maybe some other reasons. Most, but not all, because there are some lesbians who choose to stay married. Bisexual women, on the other hand, if they come out, they will more often tend to stay married. But the not having a positive relationship, I haven't run into that is not common or uncommon. I've run into lots of lesbians who still have a very close relationship with their husbands. In fact, when I was talking in Seattle, there was a lesbian who had moved back from the Midwest because she realized she missed her husband, her kids. She lived to be near, so was on good terms with her husband. I'm in the process of interviewing a bunch of them now, so I'll know better, but that's all we hear about because it's bad news. But there are some that are quietly staying with their husbands. And it all depends how strong the lesbian community is. The lesbian and gay communities make it very difficult for lesbians and gays to stay married. Number one, they don't want to date a married person. And number two, they can't understand it. I mean, I'm speaking in generalities. How do I know? I invite anyone to disagree.
Amity, my experience with people, first of all, is that they're incredibly consistent. No matter what the circumstance, they're going to behave in pretty much the same way. They tend to be judgmental about one thing, they're judgmental about everything. They're accepting. If they're open-minded, whatever it is. So I think we make huge mistakes to think that these behaviors are dependent on the situation. But beyond that, I'm thinking about the lesbian women, particularly who I've worked with, who were looking at leaving heterosexual marriage. And more often than not, what I hear from them is that their husbands have never understood them. And part of the attractiveness of another woman is it's somebody who listens and somebody who understands.
Yeah, in the second edition, there was of the book that wasn't the story about that. And this is a typical woman thing. You say, the husband doesn't understand me.
Straight women
So,
say it about straight
that's what I'm saying. It's a woman thing.
It's a woman thing, you're right.
Right. So it's so easy to read the gay factor into all of these situations. And you just have to try to tease it out and just say, look at it. one of the exciting things is that the current research I'm doing is how couples maintain their marriage or a positive relationship after disclosure. And it's so interesting to see the lengths to which both spouses try to improve their communication skills and their being honest with each other skills and their empathy skills. And I'm beginning to think that the next book I write is going to be a marriage guide as told by these couples, because they really are working out ways to do it. And sometimes, no one in this room, of course, but sometimes the coming out and the divorce is an easy excuse for already a bad marriage, or the last straw in a bad marriage. You know, they can cope it, but this is the last thing, and it's easier. You know, it's hard enough. But if you could imagine, we who are straight could imagine what it would have been like if we were teenagers and weren't allowed to flirt and date with the opposite gender. We'd be berserk if finally when we were in our 40s we were allowed to. And so when gay and lesbians come out, they do act like teenagers in a candy store. They tell me that all the time. They've waited all these years and they've never had a chance to be a teenager before, and they act like it. So if you live through that first and second year, that's why I say go slowly, slowly. Live through those first couple of years, they'll simmer down and sort things out. And some decide, gee, I really don't want that life, I'd rather stay married. But it's probably one of two pieces of advice I give anyone who's calls is take it slowly. Don't make any major decisions for 2 years, at least, till your shock is worn down, since their teenager-ish stuff has worn down. If you can just slow down the process.
Can I ask, building on that, it seems to me that you're saying, or that I'm hearing, that it is common for people who, ex-husbands and ex-wives, straight and of mixed orientation, to learn how to get along, or to continue to have a good, sometimes very close relationship. And I have that in my relationship with my ex-husband. We're still very best friends and very close. But that has now become a source of friction in my current relationship. And I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
because we don't have children together, my ex-husband and I, and so my boyfriend says, what do you need to see this guy for? What do you need to ever have anything to do with him? Why don't you flush him down the toilet? He's yesterday, I'm today, tomorrow, you know. So I'm wondering if you see that, or if that's, how do you deal with that?
I don't know. I'm lucky enough that my second husband he's a journalist, and he finds this whole topic fascinating, and we talk about it. I had infinitum him, and he plays the devil's advocate, and he tries to do this. Well, a question you might ask is he jealous of your girlfriends? See, this ex-husband is not a threat to him.
Right.
And he fulfills a part of you that was a chunk of time.
Right.
So, I don't know, maybe you've said that all.
That's part of your life too. It's
Right,
like saying,
right.
never go back to Maine where you had a good time every summer for
Right,
6 years.
right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's- you
And he's a
can't do that.
decent person.
Right.
That's all I can think of.
Yeah.
There are no magic answers. Except, we were talking earlier today, I don't know who I've talked with. It's so easy to not pay attention to what's happening to you right here. You play old tapes to this person who you're with now. So just deal with the present and try to deal with it rather than.
Maybe in the boyfriend.
We experienced that well before the gay issue. I mean, when we first got married, my wife didn't want me to see anybody but her. I mean, any of the friends I'd been hanging out that she used to hang out with us. I mean, if I went out, it had to be with her, and it took a couple of years of us being married to where we actually had a life other than each other.
Yeah. There's a lot. Having a relationship takes work, whether it's gay, straight, lesbian, whatever. But I have no idea what time it is. I've got my California time here. Well, I guess I could, there are two possibilities. I could go on to the working toward a positive relationship with your ex or your current. I could do that for a little bit, just to give you an overview of what I may do tomorrow. And this would be your current relationship if it's heterosexual, or your old relationship. But these, I've now have responses to probably maybe 175 gay, straight, bisexual, lesbian people who either have a positive relationship or they maintained their marriage. And these are sort of in order of number of times mentioned by people. It was all open-ended what they said, which is really a description of any good relationship. But know what you're dealing with. Now the communication is, and I love some of the answers. Talk, 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 talk. People would write down. The question was, what coping skills made it possible to either keep married after the disclosure or maintain a positive relationship, or listen and keep asking questions until you understand. I mean, so often it's easy to say, well, you can communicate better, but they were saying specifics. Communicate exactly how you feel and make sure he understands. The honesty had to do not just with the gay or lesbian spouse saying what he'd done or would do or might do, but for the straight spouse to be able to say, I hurt, I'm in pain, what you did makes me feel awful, I am devastated, I want to commit, I mean, to be honest to each other about where you are. And over and over, the spouses would say that. Love was one of the top coping strategies, or the conditions that made it happen. But it really was demonstrating love, and a lot of the gay and lesbians would say, make sure you go to extra lengths to make your spouse feel like the most important person in the world. Make them feel like the primary relationship, even though you have a lover on the side. But love was an important ingredient, as long as it was made tangible to the other person. Not just I love you. Joint efforts. What they said was they had to do it alone. There was no one there to help them. Very few therapists knew what to do. Very few friends supported it. The church either supported their staying together but monogamous, or they said get away. So most of them said we did it alone, we did it together, we both compromised, we both gave up things. And taking their time. Taking the time for the straight spouse to get through the shock. Taking the time to let the straight spouse vent and not get defensive. Taking time to let all these ups and downs and teenage stuff take care of itself. I know it's hard after a while. And for each of them being responsible for their own stuff. In other words, they said, don't take on anybody else's pain and don't feel you can make them responsible for doing what they're going to do. Empathize, feel with them, but don't say, oh, I'm so sorry. Empathize, but don't take responsibility for the other person feeling bad because it's his problem. And trying to understand each other's needs and mutual respect. And they sound very Pollyanna-ish. But they were the result of these people who'd been out from anywhere from 7 months to 28 years. They had just kept working at it. And even with a positive relationship, and even with people responded who were, a lot of people responded to this who had been divorced. And this is what they used to maintain their positive relationship, to keep working on it.
Strikes me that the last one for children would be extremely valuable.
Yeah, if the children could see the parents respecting one another. A lot of this, yeah. It's a model. I mean, if the parents can do this, it's a model for the children for any kind of relationship, a best friend. Well, this is a lot to throw at you. I would like to end up with the dedication to my book, and then maybe if people want to talk individually, I've got some handouts, if you want. I worried about this book. I didn't know, I didn't want to step on anyone's toes, but I felt so strongly that we're in a society where everything is polarized. It's us against them, it's black against white, it's gay versus straight, it's Republican, Democrat, it's religious right, it's whatever, back and forth and back and forth. And I just really feel that we're a microcosm. This issue is a microcosm of everything that's happening in society. So I was hoping that we could make a breakthrough, but maybe we will. So I've dedicated it to my children whose love sustained me in my journey from trauma to transformation after my husband came out in 1983, to the few friends who knew and dared support me without knowing what it really means to be on the other side of the closet, the 2 million other straight spouses and their children whose stories aren't here, yet who could tell similar tales of pain and increased strength and understanding, and the readers of this book with hope for spouses facing apart, partners coming out, for mixed orientation couples trying to stay together, and for their children coping with grown-up issues. With compassion for homosexual and bisexual persons coping with the intolerance of society, and with encouragement to those who view gay, lesbian, and bisexual issues from extreme positions to consider the middle ground where the human condition common to all of us plays out its uneven course in individual lives. So with that, I thank you for coming out.